Wildlife Science, Conservation, and Welfare through art, culture, literature, movies, talks, and panel discussions. Our expectation is that people who have attended our events conducted at this capital city on their own or with their proximity to the people from policy making help in developing appropriate conservation and welfare measures for wildlife, including elephants. So this is a quick overview of what Friends of Elephants actually is. So for this month, we have two experts from the field of wildlife science. The first is a talk by Dr. Ramesh Krishnamurthy on tracking elephants and leopards. The second part is a conversation with Dr. Bindu Raghavan with Dr. Ramesh Krishnamurthy on elephants and leopards and what they share in common. And after we finish the talk, we have the question and answer session, which will be moderated by Ankul Shetty. Yeah. So, without delay, let's go on to the first speaker. Like I already mentioned, the first talk is about tracking elephants and leopards by Dr. Ramesh Krishnamurthy. A quick introduction about Dr. Ramesh. Dr. Ramesh completed sorry, he completed his BSc from one second. I'm sorry. Yeah, he completed his BSc from Tamil Nadu, after which he joined WII in 1995 as a biologist in the multidisciplinary forestry research education and extension project in the Great Himalayan National Park of Himachal Pradesh. He carried out a detailed investigation on the charismatic pheasants, including the elusive western tragopan, and which further gave him a PhD degree in 2003. Some of his research projects include study of tiger and associated species in the Terai Arc landscape, reintroduction of tiger in Panna Tiger Reserve, Central India, conservation breeding of Western tragopan in Himachal Pradesh, establishment of state-of-the-art landscape ecology and visualization laboratory for the National Mission on Sustaining Himalayan Ecosystem, Indo-US collaborative project on wireless sensor communication, and eBird technology for tiger reserves in 2013. Apart from this, he provides teaching inputs in landscape ecology, ornithology, habitat ecology, wildlife management, remote sensing and GIS, and human-wildlife conflict management. So we are very honored to have you, and without further delay, please take over. Thank you.
Thank you, Aksha, for this nice introduction and giving an overview of this whole event. So, good evening, everyone. I think as you would have seen from my the introduction, I'm nowhere connected to elephant, nowhere connected to leopard. So I basically started with the birds and worked in different landscape. But talking about friends of elephant, but I can tell you very honestly, but the elephant is my most favorite species, and it's also the species that I'm most fearful of. So therefore, when this discussion took place 2 weeks back in Kodagu about giving this talk, I was initially reluctant about the elephant, but then when I look back, kind of an experience that we have with the whole interface activity, then I thought, okay, this could be an opportunity to try and put together. So I will be sharing my presentation about these two species. Hope it's clear. Somebody can confirm if it is clear.
Yes, sir, it is clear.
Yeah, and my voice is also clear, I hope.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
So talking about tracking elephant and leopard, it's more about what we did in some parts of the country. And to highlight here, I think these two species are in conflict. But to me, more than the conflict, they are the conservation cornerstone, if you really understand them in a way that needs to be understood. So putting things in perspective, the context of this particular discussion would be talking about how elephant and leopard, I mean, in this context, Asian elephant and common leopard, the subspecies that we have in India, they're probably the most familiar species in its range. Okay, wherever they are, I think you can maybe try to reflect yourself and see many other species. but you would find these two species are more familiar to the people wherever this is found. So therefore, they remain the true flagship species. We need to get this very clearly. So for conservation, the flagship species agenda is still holds true, and we are using it. But these two species, to me, are the true flagship species. So the second point that I wanted to indicate here is these are species of interface. Okay, they mostly, I mean, of course, they live in the forest and live in the deep inside the reserves and etc. But they are also the species of interface and live in a mosaic habitat. So from a landscape context, so these are very clear landscape species. And from the perspective of National Wildlife Action Plan that India has just come up with, I mean, 2017 to 2031. So one of the agenda is about conflict. But then overall, if you look at the whole plan, I think these two species have potential to drive the landscape agenda as well as the conflict agenda of the National Wildlife Action Plan. In fact, all other subjects also will be related if these two species are taken care of, because many of you know the conservation is more to do with the people and the management in the interface. So as indicated earlier, these are species of serious conflict with human consistently. I mean, wherever you look at in terms of time scale, look at the spatial scale, you would find them somewhere or other related to some sort of conflict. So what it causes, the impact to the people, mostly this livelihood, the psychological aspects of the people. Therefore, it invokes the negative response from the affected people. While many of us who are not affected might vouch for or lobby for the animal rights and then their welfare, but the people who are really very much close to this interface areas, who are facing these difficulties, so they of course would nurture this negative response. So this negative response coming from these two species or one or either of the species wherever they are, or some places both occur. So it turns the whole conservation agenda into some other direction. So that's why it is a complex management. They actually bring about complex management problem. So can turn this conservation trajectory, whatever investment that we put together, we bring in big projects. So village location, I mean, anything that we may even do for different species, but these two have the potential to turn around things. So also many of us would like to have coexistence agenda. I think many of us often will talk, we need to live with animals. I'm not sure, because these are two species, they more look at co-management than coexistence. So that's my personal opinion. So these are some of the contexts I wanted to start with. So elephant, I mean, elephants all over the world, if you look at it, we have about 40,000. That's the statistics some of our friends who are working on elephants brings to us, minus the 10% of the African elephant population. I mean, as you see, it's a very interesting and intelligent species, and it can negotiate human, and I think it's very challenge for us to deal with this species. So looking at the distribution range, you can see the current distribution. It's concentrated in the eastern part of this world. And within Indian context, you see this clear population, southern India, east central India, they call it recently. And then there's the northern population and the eastern population. So these four population, but then, so the other parts of the world in Southeast Asia, you have them, but the population size is not as big as what we have in India. So within India, I think the major concentration we have in the Western Ghats, I mean, over 15,000 population as per whatever the estimate that we have. And then the second one is the eastern population, the central India population. But then one important thing that I want to highlight here, while this Western Ghats and the Northeast populations are more contiguous, but the central Indian population is much more spread out. Even with this 3,000 elephant, they're much more spread out. In fact, we start seeing dispersal even those places where we did not have them. For example, Madhya Pradesh, earlier we used to have elephants coming to Sanjay Dogri Tiger Reserve, but then now they've gone all the way to Bandhavgarh, and in fact, they used to also go to Kana a little bit. So things are changing on the ground. So in terms of conflict, you can see, I mean, you see more people getting killed by elephant than the elephant getting killed, but elephant death is not directly by what people are retaliatory killing. So there could be few numbers in different parts of the world, but then the lot of death takes place through electrocution. Very recently, you must have read the news. All over, the government responded to an RTI, about 400, over 400 individuals have died due to electrocution. So these are some of the statistics for us. But then, if you go deeper into these statistics, you will know the severity of the problem, the spread of the problem, and the repercussions not only on these two species, but also on the general conservation agenda. So I think that's a message that I wanted to communicate here. Coming to leopard, I think it's many of you know it's a very clever species, and it's most widely distributed, the large phyllid. I mean, you can see it's a distribution all over from Africa, the savanna, and then Middle East and India and Southeast Asia, all this China part. And we have, as per the IUCN classification, 9 subspecies. Many of you know this. I'm not going to go into the detail. But what is striking is from the historical population, the range, this is what we have for each of them. So you can actually look at it from this African subspecies, the 33% is what is left. And from our Indian context is only 28%. You can imagine very well that what could have been the number in the past. It's a given range, because even in whatever range that we have, we know the recent statistic that is coming from India, we are having about 12,000 leopards. So that's in the roughly about 30% historical range. Okay, even within this existing the forest cover, I mean, this area that have been sampled, so it is only about 28% of the area where this leopard is. So you can kind of see this the distribution, and even in this concentrated habitat, these numbers are not very small. And that talks about the kind of challenges that people might be facing all over. And that also brings about the kind of management challenges that the officers and the staff are facing with respect to these two species. So one of the quotes that I really like to quote, Vidya Atre, when he mentioned in some of the paper, so the line separating wilderness and civilization is blurred, which is true, which is getting more and more. And it's applicable to many of the species in interface. This blurred continuum, basically the continuum is actually existing. It's very difficult to actually separate in most cases. So because of the whole nature of this interface, which is getting blurred, and the behavioral plasticity, some of these species can actually adapt. Both the species, for example, they have high behavioral plasticity. They can adapt to a wide range of resources. If leopard can take wide prey, elephant can actually take on most of the forage that is available. So they can also adapt because they can handle, they can negotiate. In fact, to me, the survival skill of both the species is their ability to negotiate human, dominate a landscape. So that makes these species to be more successful species. So in terms of the leopard, often it's been quoted as, this most conflict species because of this nature only. So very often she says, this particular statement is about leopard is most often implicated in attacks on people because of the whole complexity of the habitat as well as behavioral aspects. So many leopards that's getting also killed. I think many of them are known. The statistics are available and many are unknown. But the trend is something that we need to take note of. But putting this background aside, overall, when we say these two species are of interest species, what exactly means is bringing these people and conservation. Because for any conservation efforts to succeed, it is important to have the support of local communities. So that's well established now. So people's support to conservation is lost. I quote, I basically want to underline here. People's support to conservation loss due to conflict. So the conflict could be a single most factor to kind of address the whole conservation situation. So that's what when I started off this discussion, they are conservation cornerstones. Because if conflict can actually affect the people, in turn, people turn against conservation, no matter what we do, things will go into this undesirable direction. So this is why conflict management is to be seen not only just a situational problem, rather long-term problem, and not only the animal welfare problem, it's also the human welfare problem. So I think that the conflict management with respect to these two species are something that we need to really understand more clearly and resolve. So cost of conservation, as always known, is primarily borne by the local communities in form of not only livestock loss due to conflict, but also livelihood loss due to increased restriction. So this is something going beyond the conflict, because the relationship here is one side, there is more and more conservation reserves, setting aside and with the restrictions. Other side, which basically means that you're pushing this boundary of the people using the forest into lesser dimension, so which basically increases the conflict situation. That's what this particular statement is trying to highlight. So you can see this. I mean, the elephant getting killed in electrocution, which I said earlier on in terms of statistics, but that's happening all over. And there are many other situations you must have been hearing from the news every day. I mean, wherever the elephants are, these situations are common. And this is also not uncommon. I mean, even though there are a lot of people getting killed and attacked, so this retaliatory efforts by people across the country is very common. So in fact, these situations puts things into very different perspective for us to deal with it, because it's always very challenging to deal with the human-leopard conflict, because the way it lives, the habitat it chooses, the distance between the people and this habitat and the species population is much narrower. So these are some of the sites that you don't want to see, but it happens. So now it comes to the situation of what are the key drivers of the conflict, because we often look at these two species as a potential problem species or actual problem species. But to resolve the conflict, we need to really understand the drivers. I'm not saying that people don't understand. There are a lot of people who have been studying these two species to know them. But to put them in a kind of a action plan, and some of these points that I wanted to highlight. One is the configuration and change. I think the need to map the landscape configuration and this temporal and spatial change is important, because the interface areas are increasing with a significant impact for people and animals. The second aspect, which I do not see many places, even the recent publication, do not touch upon more comprehensively. If it is there, I may not be aware because I'm not very familiar with these two species in terms of the details. So the biological and socioeconomic imperatives, for example, looking at the intrinsic characters of the animals. Sometimes, I mean, both the species for that matter, they do have intrinsic behavioral aspects. They would come out, they would interact, they would disperse. So that needed to be understandable. Do whatever, but then these biological driver will make the species to come out, make these individuals to come out. And then the livelihood concerns of people. They push us the boundary of threshold, because this is something that we need to constantly understand. It cannot be uniform. There are variations where these boundaries get pushed and then manifests into the larger issue of the push factors and pull factors. These two, both biological and social, the drivers enable or facilitate the push factors and pull factors, because of which this conflict or the interface activity will continue to happen, or even get magnitude getting added. So these things are there. The other one, which is more relevant, I would say, to manage from a immediate and short term, is the attitude and behavior of people and animals. So we really need to understand the individual based population level behavioral responses, because this is applicable to both human as well as these two species. How we as an individual, how we as a population behave, particularly in the interface areas or even beyond. And similarly, how individuals and the population behave of the wildlife in these interspace areas would basically determine the level of conflict. So understanding the conflict and then looking at the solution, I would want you to take a look at this particular flowchart where the human wildlife conflict drivers, I mean, as I said, it's applicable to both the species. Looking at the biological driver side, where you focus on prey and forage availability, look at the habitat, cover, water, and their own social dynamics. So whether the species have what kind of natal area, when they actually start dispersing, where do they go, all these things. And then also looking at some of these anthropogenic activities which are operating there. And similarly, on the socioeconomic driver, you're looking at the distribution pattern. When I said the configuration of the human settlements, the economics of the communities and resource extraction, beliefs and attitude towards, I mean, there's a large carnivore conservation, tiger is retentive, it's about the species, and psychoeconomic and perceived losses. Sometimes this economic loss is actual, sometimes you also perceive it. Just because you cannot access the area, you actually lose livelihood. So that also happens. So these losses also needed to be accounted for. While in this recent year, when we talking about ecosystem services, there's also a group of people who talk about disservices. These disservices are coming from these two dimensions. So with this conflict driver, only then we can look at conflict resolution strategies as a whole. So probably with these drivers and with these elements in each of the drivers can then be understood clearly and then addressed as and when the requirements are. So this is one general example. That's a study that's been done by one of our students at the Wildlife Institute. So looking at the space and interspace, basically. So where exactly people are, as I mentioned earlier on, of the configuration. So what exactly mediates the usage of animals, in the human dominant landscape is one of the questions. But when you look at it deeper, it's the food resources, whether you actually provide them or it's available naturally, or we don't manage whatever the wastage, things like that. I think the food resources is something that basically facilitates the animals to use the human dominant landscape. The second aspect is about the tolerance. People tend to tolerate because, see, even in the human wildlife conflict situation, people also try to see to what extent they need to react. So, because if the threshold is breached, is when the response is also very strong. Other than that, this understanding of what people call it generally as coexistence is more of a, the tolerating to some extent and then trying to manage. They do manage, they try to prevent. So that is where I try to use this term from a coexistence to co-management, because while these professionals, the department would manage, but then people are also managing. But then so far it's probably more independent, but with this greater understanding of the issues to be resolved in the long term. So this co-management concept comes up clearly. So the tolerance do exist, but then tolerance can be kind of compromised if this current land uses or current pattern changes. Because wherever the conflict is not happening or where conflict is happening, you can actually look at it. People probably kind of tolerate that limit has been crossed. So that is where we need to really understand, focus on the status quo, see where the status quo exists, where people are able to manage, but that needed to be, should not be ignored. Many of the time we tend to ignore those aspects, focus on where conflict is currently happening, because the areas where it is not happening now may actually happen in the future. So this whole view of the people, because in this particular case, people view this particular, the human use of the, wildlife use of the area in the human dominant area as okay, fine. So far, as long as these animals do not cause so much damage to our crops or people, then it's fine. But the moment it happens, when the land use changes, then the situation can completely change. So sometimes these animals come out, as I said, because of this inherent characteristics. So this is one example where on bull of 15 to 20 years age is in Haridwar Forest Division. It had actually come to this place. This is the BHL area. Mostly its uses. This is Rajaji Park, and this is the Haridwar Forest Division. It generally moves around. So it also caused human death. So there's also small forest patch here. So it actually goes there and then feeds there. So in this case, so of course, when there's a human death, you need to respond. So the department and this whole the technical team, they tried to capture this elephant. Elephant, it was captured and it was relocated across the Ganges. So this was in the Haridwar side and got relocated across. So you can see this sequence of events, like after getting reported, then after seeing the incidences with the permission process, capturing all happened. It happened in 2018. So the whole process of tracking, capturing, loading, translocating, it's a huge process when it comes to elephant. And even putting the radio collar is huge. This was a collar actually that time was taken from the Western Ghats from the WLF team. So it was flown quickly to put on this elephant. So it's a satellite enabled GPS collar. So this animal was collared and released. So you can see this particular map and the eastern part of Rajaji. So it was released here. This elephant was mostly hanging around. You can see the time period, even this January to May, it's 9 months period. It generally was hanging around, but one fine day, I think you also needed to see January, the water level was also not great, but still elephant did not cross across. But in the month of May, so this actually went here and then crossed. It went to the other side. So you can actually see this. Even after putting this video collar and then translocating them elsewhere, it came back. It again caused some kind of one more death. And of course, this was something was not expected, or the reaction was much more severe. So the animal was captured again and translocated, or it was brought to the same place and then it became a captive animal. It was confined and then trained. It's one of the captive animal now in Rajaji. So what I'm trying to say is that sometimes these local solutions of translocation do offer some relief to some extent, but may not be the long term. But we also cannot just think, okay, this doesn't offer it, we don't have to do it. But if you look at this one, in terms of the disposal that's taking place in many parts of the countries, for example, Chhattisgarh, South Bengal, Andhra Pradesh, and Madhya Pradesh, this is one of the example of this collared elephant which was studied by elephant cells. So he's been able to, just study and then showcase how these elephants are actually. So you can clearly see they are actually tracking those fragments. The higher the fragments, you're going to have more, issues. So in fact, there's a lot of death because of this interface here. So the understanding these elephants through telemetry allows better management options, even though there is general reluctance, to put radio telemetry on animals. But I think now people have realized for a conflict situation, the telemetry offers a kind of an early warning system. So there are other technological solutions that people are looking at it, but particularly for those interface animals, which you think potentially a problem animal, these GPS-enabled collars are very useful. I think people are now using even very recent example where this is one of the captive elephant which is released, also is being monitored through satellite-enabled GPS collars in Tamil Nadu. Coming to leopard, I think leopard is, again, I said, much more clever, a very difficult species to deal with. It's too numerous in number, and they work in the human habitation. And we've had incidences of 31 attack on human by leopard in very small parts of Rajaji. So between 2014-18, you can see the statistics. So there are also deaths, many deaths. In fact, you can see this distribution of the death. All this red marks are human death, and others were attacked. It's a human-dominated area with a very small percentage of forest. So when you look at the behavior, you can see this is a camera trap data. So where we call them, the green portion is a non-conflict zone, this yellow portion is a conflict zone. But most of these leopards are concentrated in the non-conflict zone. You see this total, the number, it's one of the high density of leopard in the country, 33 leopard per 100 square kilometers, probably the highest density of leopard. Again, we're talking about small area of 80 square kilometer. But the distribution of the leopard in the non-conflict zone and conflict zone is very different, because in the conflict zone is much more concentrated, when non-conflict zone is well spread. So what it indicates is these animals, the behavioral selection is very clear between these two zones. Not only that, you can also look at this, the overlap with the human activity, even in terms of the activity. The non-conflict zone, the leopard is generally active all through the period, with some peak in the early morning. But the percentage overlap is also not very high. You can see this in the non-conflict zone areas. The overlap with the human is 56%, which basically means it could be forest staff, it could be others. But whereas in the conflict zone, it's only 24%. So to me, it is more of an animal trying to avoid human. So consciously, wherever possible, I've seen the similar example in Sri Lanka, where leopard distribution is kind of very clear between this human-dominated area and non-human dominated area. So the animals are, most of the time, whether it's leopard, elephant, they tend to kind of modify its behavior depending on where the human are active. But then it's a human behavior problem is most of the time causes this conflict. So because of this, leopards are widespread in the state of Uttarakhand with so much of cases. Historically, many of you must have read Jim Corbett, and the situation probably is not as severe, but then the incidents of leopard attacks and death is also happening. So to address this, I think as a part of this, the GIS support project by MOEF and the state of Uttarakhand, it's also happening in Karnataka and the West Bengal. So there were 8 potential leopards were actually captured and then attached with GPS and satellite collar, and they were relocated in many different places. You can see this. So this is one of the leopards which is actually caught in Roorkee. It's close to the town. It's a completely human-dominated agriculture areas and no forest, very small fragments here and there. This leopard was caught and then translocated across the Ganges. So far, people never talked about leopard crossing big rivers and all. Mostly we know it's tigers do cross, but then we never knew this happens. But then after a few exploration, a few days, this leopard went around and looked for all the opportunity and promptly crossed back and then came back to this area. So, I mean, we've been able to monitor it very recently because of the battery that, in fact, it has been monitored since last September. So almost a year now. So the collar battery is down. So this has been now removed. Similarly, there's another leopard which was actually caught in Narendranagar, which is higher up from Rishikesh. It was brought here and released here. So it actually they explored all these parts and then went back. So this also happened. And similarly, the other one, which is from Bageshwar, is far away in the Pithoragarh part. It was about some 70-80 kilometers apart. It was brought down and then released somewhere in Almora. And again, it just tracked all over and went to this area where it was. And the other one that happened close to Dehradun, this particular patch, I'll tell you, it's few square kilometers surrounded by the purely human habitation. And people did not even know, but found this is concentrated. It was released somewhere here in the forest area, but then just went tracking. This is Wildlife Institute, actually, very close. So this particular forest patch that you see, it's the Wildlife Institute campus, and this adjoining forest patch. This leopard went negotiated and stayed here, and it died actually. And then the other leopard again came from Bageshwar. It again tracked back. And this one is coming more closer to the Kalsi division. And you can see this is all operating in a completely human-dominated landscape. So this is how these 8 leopards have behaved. I think most of these animals explored and gone back. So if you look at in terms of the distances, it varies from 4 kilometer to 39 kilometer from the aerial distance. Actually, the actual distance is much larger, but the number of days that has taken to come back to the original site is from 11 days to 96 days it has taken. So these are some of the statistics that we have. But what was interesting is to compare with what Vidya has highlighted in the original paper in 2010. When translocation takes place, when you're trying to translocate this potential conflict element somewhere, she says about 325% increase in leopard attacks on the release. But in these 8 cases, we have not seen any of them. So it's really a matter of where it is released and how these individual leopards behave. Because all these 8 leopards come from different spatial locations and their habitat, the familiarity is different. Even in this very high human-dominated landscape in Roorkee, although people are panicky and then it's been captured again and things like that. But this increase in the attack is not the case. It's probably situational. That I think this needs to be really look into this general the information that is coming from. So coming to the end of my discussion, I would say the whole conflict with these 2 species need to be addressed from these 3 perspectives, looking at the immediate or crisis situation and short-term situation, long-term situation. So very often we only tend to hear the conflict management as a crisis situation. That's probably the reason why our preparation is not very strong. So having now more information about these species and devising a strategy with respect to the situation that we have in hand, I think the solutions can also be better. So the methods that we generally have for these situations to deal with are physical methods where you talk about barrier, you talk about some of the fencing, all those things. The biological methods where you talk about trying to look at the population management or contraceptives or other population control methods. The psychological methods where you try to create this panicky or some other mechanism in which you increase the fear factor or make these animals to avoid situation. The other one is use of the technology. There could be early warning technology. There could be active driving technology. Now with the new, I think many of you listening to this, I would say the technological intervention in India is actually getting better. And with the data policy, which is more flexible now, and this very recent the drone policy, which is government has come up with, I think it's one of the best policies that we have anywhere in the world, I would say, because we've seen this the first draft, now this final notification, that Gazette notification that has come the last week. I think it allows many of us professionals to experiment the use of drone in multiple ways. I mean, not only for this conflict management, even for many other research actions. So finally, this is what I wanted to just leave you with. And we do have this kind of situation in the country. And I don't think we need to have them very often. Things have to change. And so when this is very recently, I just picked up from the internet, it's attracted me. So it's not coexistence just because people and animals are around each other. I mean, that's a very clear statement. But this also happened. We also tend to see this, whatever that is. I mean, people have experienced of living very close to animal. So with that, I really like to conclude my presentation saying that how these two species have been a very important species for conservation, because we tend to see them as a negative because where it is involved in. But as a larger conservation agenda, I think these two species have the potential to kind of drive the conservation discourse that we are all interested in. With that, I like to thank some of these people and the department which facilitated the data collection, things like that, and my students and the research from Tiger Cell. And thank you, everybody, for listening to me. Looking forward to interacting with Dr. Bindu and then taking questions from many of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ramesh. Thank you for taking us through the conflict situations in different parts of the country, for giving us your observations, and also for telling us about the different tracking methods that are being employed to manage this conflict. So next, the next part of our event is the conversation with Dr. Bindu Raghavan. Is a veterinarian with a PhD in immunology and infectious diseases from Washington State University, USA in 2016. She worked as a scientist in epidemiology and animal health at the Colombian Corporation for Investigation in Agriculture and Livestock, Colombia, and as a professional fellow at the Wildlife Institute of India in Dehradun. Currently, she is a principal scientist of wildlife diseases at CWS in Bangalore. Dr. Raghavan's research interests broadly include biodiversity conservation and sustainable use of natural resources. Specifically, she is interested in the interactions between humans, livestock, and wildlife, especially at the resource use and disease interface, and the role of diseases as a driver of wildlife population dynamics. She uses a combination of ecological, microbiological, immunological, geospatial, and epidemiological tools to understand the factors that impact animal health, environmental health, and human health and well-being. So this is a little bit about Dr. Bindu Raghavan. So I request Dr. Raghavan to please take over and have a very, have a
Thank you, Aksha. I think we've lost you in between. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah, Bindu, yes.
Okay. So, Ramesh, yes, can I go ahead?
Did you lose was I cut off when I was introducing you?
No, you were fine, just towards the end. That's fine. Okay. So, Ramesh, thank you for such an interesting and very, insightful talk, especially using examples from case studies and all. That was very interesting to really understand for many of us how human wildlife conflict actually pans out on the ground. So even reading all these papers on human-wildlife conflict, especially elephant and leopard conflict with humans, and now even listening to your talk, what comes through is that there is a willingness of people to coexist. There is, except of course when it involves human bodily injury, which I think would make anybody angry. So then, if people are willing to coexist with these animals, what is missing in the picture then? Why are we still dealing with this level of conflict that we see? What do you think is missing in this entire picture of management of human-wildlife conflict?
It's not about the missing point. I think rather the situation getting added up, because from the historical context to now, to me, Bindu, I think it's one side, the habitat, the degradation and loss aspect. With, of course, this is a very general thing about human population increase. I think there are two situations we need to talk about this particular case when you say. One is the people who are traditionally be living in the forest area. There are people who actually establish themselves in unfamiliar wilderness. Okay, I think sometimes it gets added up. When we look at the human-wildlife conflict, no, all human are treated the same. No, I think if somebody who's actually having some town, or somebody who wants to have a very expand agriculture areas, they wanted to have set up. Many people like to set up themselves close to the human habitation, even agriculture expansion taking place there. So I think that situation is where people are unable to deal with it. But whereas the people who traditionally lived in the forest area, they have. So it's. I don't know whether you want to call that as a coexistence. People have lived with an option. Okay, this is our option. So I would rather like to call that way, because they know, okay, this is a problem, but then that is my option. So this option seems to be better to me than that option. Therefore, I tolerate or adjust and live. So that is what many of these people, traditionally forest dwelling people, are still there. And for them, even when you ask them now, oh, there's so much of issue, the children are affected, they don't really mind it. And you know the Gujars example, you know many other examples. But when it comes to this very vocal and the people who are more unfamiliar, who probably, I mean, this basically brings to this particular aspect of the education. I think the field level education, not about the school education, organized education. I think unorganized education at this fringe areas also is very important, because these people who are not familiar or who are actually trying to get into even those, one of the questions that comes up, even who are creating this linear infrastructure without all this, I think these are the things that is adding up. That's what I feel this
That
missing or
actually
other, yeah.
that brings me to my next point, is that like you correctly pointed out, it's not really coexistence, but people are willing to negotiate their way around elephants and leopards, given certain tools of how to do that negotiation. But they don't get those tools, neither from us as conservationists nor from the forest department. We are all working in our different silos, right? So what do you think, like what can the forest department do in terms of getting more actually involving these communities as true stakeholders, not just stakeholders as in, okay, I'll give you compensation, sign this paper and that's enough, but actually community stakeholders in the conservation of the species themselves, and thus managing human wildlife conflict as if it matters for them, right? So what can the forest department, do you think, what can forest department or even we as conservationists do to enable these communities?
Yeah, I think thank you for that much simpler question to me, actually, because it's I think when people talk about mainstreaming conservation, these are very big jargons that we often use. Okay, mainstreaming biodiversity, mainstreaming all that. So the mainstreaming doesn't take place if the local communities is not part of it. So therefore, two things come to my mind. One is getting the people who are at the interface to actually have the shared vision or goal. I mean, it might sound very jargonized, but let me explain it later as to what I exactly mean by this. So getting these people involved in a way where the local, that is where I said these actions of the conflict management, I need to be categorized. Crisis, short term, long term. Because you can get people on board for only two things when it comes to wildlife. One is when there's a conflict situation, or when there is a lot of incentives.
Exactly.
Otherwise, we cannot just keep saying that animals are good and conservation is good unless it serves purpose. So since conflict can bring people without money, so I think it's an important for us to recognize from forest department for us. Okay, there is a situation. I think I remember in the state of Odisha, they do have local people, youths involved in elephant management. If the elephant comes up as a part of the team, they have this response team. The communities are involved. But that's again is a little bit of ad hoc in terms of how long we can engage and what kind of economic incentive. That is one aspect that I feel it's possible. The second aspect is now with I think the Biodiversity Act, now with this global sustainable development goals and the post biodiversity action, I think this district development plans, village development plans needs to have one of this as the agenda. Otherwise, the development agenda do not see these as the problem or challenge. So if we can ensure this, I think that to me will be the long-term solution.
But again, coming to those development plans, I think, we're talking about fencing and we're talking about changing cropping patterns. We're talking about putting GPS on the animals to see where they're going. But, all of these different drivers, we're saying, okay, they're coming out to look for food. The leopards are coming out to look for prey, easy prey, or they are looking for, places where they can give birth or hide. But the truth of the matter is the biggest driver for all of this is change in land use patterns, right? So is there something that, does our policy address this, where instead of just putting all our resources into fighting conflict or managing conflict, are we doing anything to bolster those fragmented landscapes, making sure there's contiguity, making sure that our forests don't get fragmented even further, or land use changes, they're not further diverted to human land use? So is there is there something like that in the action plan? Can we target something like that?
I think you answered the question itself. I would say. So the reason is I think when we talk about UNFCCC, we talk about because this is an year of restoration. Okay, so I think if the restoration agenda is kind of aligned towards this, I mean, because we generally have degradation, we generally have habitat loss, but instead of generalizing, if you can manage it with the local zone processes, it can happen. I think I would say since people are talking about it, since there's a huge investment now, currently even the government talking about I think carbon credit and then smart green villages. These are some of the programs many of the governments are taking up. So I can give you one small example with my little understanding. What I can say is when we talk about this conflict, see, one is, as you said, about the prey and other things. The other conflict that takes place either with the elephant or even with the leopard is a dispersal stage. During the dispersal stage. So suppose if many of our river systems, so instead of the river system being seen as, like only as a resource water, but they are also excellent corridor connectivity pathways. If these all your river courses are actually used as some kind of zonation process, if social forestry or even integrated farming is kind of promoted, I think some of the things that you mentioned can actually start taking place. Because in Nepal, I remember when we initially talked about tiger conservation, so they also promoted social forestry to create a stepping stone for a corridor. It seems to occur. But in India, I think we have much more scope through this river network. So in each will, if you do, at least you divert them. That is, see, it may not solve the entire problem, but yes, there is a less problem. Now you come to the next stage. Next stage is about, of course, you said some of this driver where the prey or habitat degradation, then you have to do more inside. But outside also, I see, I mean, I don't know how much I am right, but then I always felt that human wildlife conflict is also a habitat solution. It is not just only a individual problem, it's a habitat problem. Therefore, there's a habitat solution. So when you have habitat solution, so the interface areas have to be managed accordingly. So sometimes you might have to actively create open spaces, or rather than trying to keep everything so dense. So many of the cases in Uttarakhand part, at least in Garhwal, I think many human leopard conflict cases mostly to do this is the spatial pattern of the bushes and things like that. So while we may say, okay, all this green cover needs to be maintained, but as a professional, we need to spatially prioritize where the green cover needs to be shifted. I think that could be a strategy that we can think of.
So that's that landscape action that you were talking about in your study.
Yeah, even at the local level, because landscape as a visionary strategy, but then actual action has to happen at local level. But when I said habitat solution, let's say an example, if there is a dense lantana bush close to human habitation. there is no harm in keeping some visible zone. And instead try to create something better inside, so that at least, because animal carnivores, for example, tend to avoid those dense areas. So you can minimize it. That's and then other one is, I mean, this is nothing to do with what you were basically asking about habitat, but I don't know, there's also biofencing. Biofencing, like some situation it works. So we need to strategic fencing through physical, all other artificial fencing while people talking about it. We may not be having this luxury of the resources and things like that to do, but strategic fencing can actually be done.
Yeah, so that then means that our strategies cannot be a one size fits all solution for each area, right? Because biofencing works in some areas, and then electric fencing works in some areas, and with elephant in some areas, and then with leopards in other areas. And then early warning systems work, say for example, for elephants. We are yet to develop that for leopards. So, like do you think we need there is a need for a dynamic strategy rather than something that's very static and fixed, and like a typical management plan that is then to be put into action for 10 years, but instead of that, like something that's more dynamic and informed by real life, like changes in land use as it happens on the ground, right?
Yeah.
So is that something that India can look at or go towards?
No, absolutely. I think, Bindu, I think this is, I think important. I like to reiterate what you just said. This, the solutions with respect to this, the interface species is not common. You cannot generalize it. There has to be site specific, but then the broader contour, when I said the broader contour, for example, the driver, there's a biological driver, the social driver, the contours are the broader one, but the specific parameters within the contour could be different. So that, of course, needs to be understood at that level. Second is then solution. So this is where I wanted to use this term, I mean, emphatically so, of the co-management. Okay. Co-management is probably the solution in the long term, because people needed to be empowered in terms of the, not just being part of the crowd to chase the elephant, but I think as a society, if you look at it as long term, I think it's the panchayat or whatever, we needed to empower people with the technical know-how and even the ability to use the early warning system, because we know that everybody uses mobile. Because if you look at this initial experiment that NCF and others did it in Valpar and the areas, it was just a simple mobile and then the information spread. But then now, if you empower the people, train them, which is being done there also, and I think that can work very well. And I think, to me, we are in getting into the stage where we have no option but to empower these people and create this local mechanism. So you know that we have India that's coming up with a national action plan for human wildlife conflict management. We have SOPs, but all these again are very broad. But if you have to be implementing it local level very efficiently, that needed to be done locally. So that's where I'm highlighting again district management plan or Panchayat development plan as one of the strategies.
Yeah, I agree. And I think what is missing truly is that we are still not informing communities. For example, a lot of communities that live near forests have no idea how elephants behave, have no idea about elephant biology, have no idea about leopard biology, right? And that chunk of education is missing. The minute you tell people, look, this is how elephants behave, this is how leopards behave, and so these are the areas that you need to avoid, or these are the timings that you need to change your activity patterns, or perhaps this is the kind of area they need. So the minute you cut down forests to make way for your crops, you're inviting conflict. If people are made aware of these things, and especially in terms of leopard conflict, I think that would help a lot, because as you have pointed out, leopard and elephant, they are common because they are the interface species, but they are not the only interface species, right? We are talking about so many other interface species, and the kind of conflict that is now going to come into the future is going to be immense, because there will be conflict with all of these other interface species, including the smaller carnivores, jackals, and you have wild pigs. You already have all of that issues, right? So, and then we're not even talking about all the other conflict issues that are associated with it, which is, just by degradation of the forest, the ecosystem services we lose. So it's not just about, animals moving out of the forest, but about the loss for us in terms of the services, including water availability, and all our water cycles get disturbed. So I think there is a need, for the communities to be educated in terms of what an important role they play in conservation of these species, right?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I can again give you an example when it comes to, I mean, there are again two issues here. One is all these radio collared animals, for example, we also done similarly in central India with the tiger. So these animals go closer to human habitation, people don't even know. So many of the time they think that, okay, if the animal is coming there, it is a problem. But with this data, I mean, I think we're all guilty to this. And many of this data that we use, it doesn't go to the local communities for them to know, okay, this leopard, elephant is coming closer, and then they can go without causing any harm or without any damage. So even when I said an example of the 8 leopard is a huge sample size, when you translocate somewhere else, it's come back negotiated without causing damage. So it again talks about if this information goes to them, so they can be little comfortable. Similarly, even when I say this Roorkee leopard, when it goes to all the sugarcane fields, I remember, I mean, we were more worried than the people because when you're tracking this elephant monitoring, we know that this is right close to the village where children are playing there. Okay, we were worried sitting in Dehradun and monitoring, and then we sending out the information, and then ground level, this data also kind of made such a way that it could go to the field staff and all. But we were more concerned, and but then that information has to go. And second point is about the other non-negotiable thing. See, people negotiate, animal negotiate. Other area like if people know, okay, the elephant is coming here for this reason, if elephant is coming for sugarcane, of course, it's something that people cannot do it. So it will be a conflict situation. So similarly, if elephant will keep coming back and coming back, so we need to find a different situation. I think these two things have to be looked at slightly differently.
Correct. So, in summary, how do you think, what is the way forward for elephant and leopard conservation in India and mitigation of human-wildlife conflict in terms of these two species, especially?
Because as I started off saying that both the species are problem species, both the species are very challenging because elephant is a huge, you cannot manage. And then leopard is too clever, you cannot even know where they are. So both from that point of view, it presents you exactly a similar challenge to deal with it. So, but then since they are interface species, then they can aggressively come into human habitation. So it kind of elicits this human response. So to if you have, I mean, while we talk about so many things, people are dying, getting attacked, nobody's going to go for conservation. So if conservation resource, if conservation synthesizer, others are kind of directed to look at human wildlife conflict not as a technological or education problem, rather larger economic livelihood problem, I think that solution will help. So maybe large chunk of resources need to be diverted into this human wildlife management. So that is one. The second is about the constant education. When I say education, it's not just awareness. I think there's a lot of misconception about the human, I mean, wildlife conservation general. When we say we are basically educating people, we just do an awareness program, make them, oh, it's nice and things like this is important. But then is to educate them in a level that where they are able to understand the species better and then able to develop the skills. Because many of the skill sets are actually drawn from the communities. It's not that now they're going to be adding it. It's just a value addition of using certain tools and techniques which they don't locally available. So that's the second point. The third one, which I think it's really do the spatial planning, the land use policy solution. I think we as a nation may not have the land use policy, but I think as a smaller unit, either in the state or the district, we may have to come up with the land use policy. So I think that land use policy, particularly for elephant and other crop damaging issues, so that can be done. I think this with the land use policy, then automatically comes your zonation, and then looking at this crisis, immediate, long-term strategies. So I would look at these three aspects. The first aspect is looking at the large resources to be really recognized and converted into this. Second is a skill set. Third is the land use management. So I think that's all I can think of as of now.
That's great. That was really insightful. Thank you very much, Ramesh.
Thank you,
Very,
Indu. I think we have a lot of questions, but some of
yes.
these I already answered, I think. Aksha.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Ramesh and Dr. Bindu, for taking this forward, sharing with us your perspectives, your experiences, and I think it has really solidified our understanding of the whole situation. So, yes, you're right. We have a lot of questions, and I would request Ankul to please take over the question answer session. Uncle, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Am I audible?
Yes,
Very
you
much.
can, Uncle.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much for the sessions of beautiful discussions we have had. There are some questions which I want to take one by one. One really interesting question from Abhijna. She says, if we want to be able to fully and properly conserve animal, shouldn't conservationists try to explain coexistence with wildlife and the importance of animals to the farmer and the people who live in the less developed areas of India? Because these are the people who actually come in contact with wildlife most of the time. So what's your opinion or thought on that, sir?
I think I did explain a little bit. Maybe I like to reiterate. So those people who are actually getting impacted, either in terms of the livelihood or economic, the prosperity. So for them, the coexistence agenda comes to a point where they can tolerate, where there is a social capital, there is an economic capital which they can tolerate. Suppose as a conservationist, many of us who are sitting outside, who want all the species to live, we want people to live nicely. It becomes a duty for us now to mobilize resources so that these people can continue to exercise the social capital or the livelihood capital which they can have even with this problem. But sometimes this situation can go if there's a human death, there is no solution. You cannot compensate. So we have to really see these two, the human wildlife conflict differently. And then the moment when you say coexistence, I clarified in the beginning, people are managing. It's a rather managing. Individually, they're managing so far. If we can bring a mechanism and resources through us, the department, as professionals, and then co-management is what you're talking about. So we are rather, what you're saying is, instead of trying to teach them, you just exist with us. It's fine, it's easy to say. So rather you try to empower them through resources and the technical know-how. Okay, this is how we can manage. So we are with you and you are with us, so we co-manage. I think that is the long-term solution that you're probably indicating to.
Right, right. Thank you so much, sir. I think that also answers another question from Madhushri, where she tells that translocation cannot be a long-term solution, and compensating the victim's family also cannot be a long-term solution. So what could be a long-term solution? So I think this also answers the that question. So
no, I think I need to. I like to add, clarify a little bit. So I think it's a good question because most of the time this comes up across board.
right.
I think the translocation is not a solution, but I think translocation is a management tool. I think we need to recognize that. So we are not looking at translocation solution. Please, many of you are listening to, I think it's been recorded. I wanted to really highlight emphatically because whenever you have a problem animal, you're trying to translocate. It happens two things. One is there is an immediate relief to the people. Second, the animal also learns something. Okay, when I do this, because translocation through chemical immobilization, it's a very painful process for the animal. It does experience the problem. Okay. And third, it allows the professionals to develop their capacity. So translocation does these three things simultaneously. It's okay. Sometimes what happens is we are not talking about, as a kind of a solution, but then when you say, when the animal is coming, if you keep translocating them over and over, I think it's if you do it immediately, it happens in Madhya Pradesh. I'll tell you, in fact, Madhya Pradesh is the state many of you know, it's a high density of tiger, and the human-tiger conflict is not many. The reason is, we had this discussed a long time back. It's very surprisingly, but whenever this tiger goes into human habitation, the technical team goes before and captures and releases it, translocated. So before even people know, if the translocation takes place, the conflict is not there. To me, if this is continued as a process, it can be a long-term solution. Second is compensation is not the solution because it is not even a discussion point to me because it shouldn't happen. No human death should happen. Okay. So I think as a professional, many of us across board, doesn't matter who we are, if we have to actually, this is one area where I always felt very strong that, as a wildlife professionals, if we can try to avoid one human death in our life with our technical thing, that would be a great thing. So similarly, many of us were talking about conservation. If we can work around and say, okay, this I think these two things have to be looked at very differently.
Right. But like I rightly said, compensation is a aftermath. It's not a solution. Bindu ma'am, you want to add something to this?
No, just the same thing that, translocation, as Dr. Ramesh had initially told itself, there are 3 ways of managing human-wildlife conflict. And translocation comes in that first part, which is the crisis management, right? It's never something that's a long-term strategy for anybody. So translocation, as you rightly said, is a tool we use to avoid immediate conflict or impending conflict. And then you have to, at the same time, work at alternative strategies, which are including educating and early warning systems and all of those other larger long-term solutions, which we need to apply. And of course, land use planning, which is one of the most important drivers for human-wildlife conflict with any species in our country. So, yeah.
Thank you so much for that. There's one interesting comment, or rather question I can put it as from Vadiraj. So change in land use is not required, according to me. I would advocate a simpler way of conflict mitigation. And the example what he's giving is, farmer whose land is adjacent to forest can plant an additional row or 2 of banana or sugarcane or corn, which is not to be harvested, beyond his boundary to satisfy the crop raiding only. Since it's only for and water that the situation is created, collectively at a village level, this can be bought about a potential shift. But then I think this is something what is practiced in Assam in one village, and this was also a point of discussion in our last month's call. We had Manoj Kumar sir from CCF from Kamarajnagar, and we had Ajay Mishra sir. We discussed this, and then they were not in this favor because we are then modifying the the behavioral and food habit of the animals. So what is your both of your thoughts on this?
So I think I like to mention one point. This is an experimental suggestion. One must need to experiment. Maybe we need to really do this one of the strategy. That lesson will be sufficient. The second is I mentioned also about the pull factor and push factor. Okay, if you're actually going to plan these ones, fine. It's more kind of creating a biofence, but we also need to know to what extent. If the moment elephant comes, so that barrier can actually be broken. It can keep gapping because it's going to be counterproductive rather. So one is initially 1 or 2 elephants are coming. Now with this information going around, there's a better crop available, then you're actually going to get more. I mean, that's what I assume. The second is there is never enough for the elephant. So you cannot possibly think of creating one hedge or couple of rows would solve. It's just going to be adding to the problem. And then who has that social capital, economic capital to do this? We are talking about human-wildlife conflict problem for a people who are affected with their livelihood. See, look at it. If an elephant herd is there, if a person going to collect a fuel load cannot go, it's psychologically affected. So for that particular day, income is gone. So that's what I said, psycho-economical problem. So it is not as simple as we see. It needs to be seen from a multiple perspective, and then really depends on who is the person who's getting affected.
And I think that if somebody has that kind of land available, they should just convert it back into forest, So instead of, if you're anyways going to sacrifice that land to the elephants, why not, restore it and make it part of the forested landscape so that at least it's something that the elephant is used to. It's not going to try and come out. And like Dr. Ramesh said, you're habituating the elephants to come out. No way are they going to avoid that area again, because here's a food supply that is going to be available regularly and without any effort. And you are going to attract more animals to that area. So, and not just elephants, by the way. So, yeah, that is going to lead to more conflict.
Right. Thank you so much for that. There is also a question from Mitali Devdas. Thank you, sir, for the interesting talk. Elephants are deeply revered species based on Hindu culture. How do you see, have you seen a shift in this attitude due to conflict? Or has this aspect been one of the strategies to reduce conflict?
There is no shift at all. I think, Maithili, there is no shift at all, as long as I am not affected. So, so if I'm affected, I don't really care whether it's a mythology, whether it is somebody else, it doesn't really matter. So it's elephant also the same case. So basically, if somebody gets killed in our family and the elephant is there, then that time we don't really see immediately. So that's what I'm saying. But then what you're saying is it's an important, we could use as a currency to kind of take it to for education. So for that, it needs to accompany with the support system. So maybe for a species which does not have this value, then you have much harder explanation to do. Whereas this species, I said immediately, it's a flagship species, readily acceptable, revered species. And to me, is I think, as I said, it's the most favorite species for me. But then I am also very afraid of elephant. So, I mean, that's the kind of psychology we all work with. So to cut the story short, I would say, yes, it is still revered, but then the breaking point will decide how people respond to it.
I have something to add here. So, one classic example of this argument of revered in Hindu mythology is the cow. The minute as long as she gives milk, she's a goddess, she's whatever, and she's revered, she's sacred. The minute she stops giving milk, she's out on the road eating plastic and dying there, right? It doesn't matter. So, all our Hindu culture, all our Hindu reverence, everything goes for a toss the minute it's not useful to us anymore. So when you talk about wildlife, which don't have a obvious value per se, which we cannot see, it's not a kamdhenu, so there is no point. There's no value to them except as in the temple. That's it. So unfortunately, that's the truth of it.
Yeah, right. Thank you for that. Girish Bedge wants to say that unless there are more passionate enthusiasts who have adequate field experience, how can we drive an additional, attitudinal change among the forest and fringe communities? How do we get to the point of creating a team of experienced field volunteers? That means they have to be passionate and also, have the adequate field experience.
I totally agree with that. I agree with having a passionate enthusiast because this is what you're trying to say is a social awareness and the solution. The civilian response to support system is a service. I mean, this is what I'm saying. I mean, it can work, but then it cannot be long term unless it has economic incentive. So you can't do certain professional business just based on volunteerism. You need to create a trained cadre of people. I mean, when I say trained cadre, I'm not only talking about permanent position of staff, but it could be a team within the village sector. Of course, people can come and provide. So the passionate team that you're saying, which is outside this village setup, can actually bring technical know-how, bring economic resources, bring models of best practices. So I think these two things can parallel. Of course, one could also participate in the ground to implement things. But if you really want to make it because to me, anything that you do, unless you institutionalize it, it becomes an individual solution. Then it's only a ego-based solution. You just do it yourself, and then after you're gone, everything is gone. So no point. So I think we need to create this institutional mechanism. I think people have asked about this getting trained manpower. I think the volunteer, you don't need to be a volunteer. I won't even call it as a volunteer. You're being a part of a solution. So there are mechanism getting trained through institution. There are professional courses available. You can get into services. There is Indian Forest Service. There is a State Forest Service. If really people are passionate to resolve some issue, maybe people can get it. Even you get into the civil service. I mean, all services with a good heart and mind can lead to solution.
Yeah, there's also a follow-up question actually from Girish itself. So he asks, are there any avenues where passionate enthusiasts can volunteer for field work?
I think there are many. There are many. I just look around with many. In fact, there's lots and lots of institutions, individuals are now coming up. Earlier, there are few institutions. There are many institutions now. You just look up, even right in Bangalore, any city that you go. So you write to them and then be part of many of the projects, be there. So it's many avenues are there. I mean, maybe you can explore. If you don't have any immediate answer, you can also email me later. I can explain to you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, sir. So Abhijna wants to know what is the route to take to become a behavioral zoologist. How can we start, and what are some good wildlife centers we can work with?
We have I think institutions which is teaching natural sources, but as such at the behavioral science aspect, I mean, if I can be very honest, probably not much option in India, but I think there are many courses outside country, it's there. But having said this, if you're working in many of this ongoing projects in India, or maybe have your own project, there are quite a lot of experts in India who can actually guide you through the process. Maybe if you're a graduate, then you need to probably get into the post-graduation, any of this life sciences. I think the Mysore University, if I'm not wrong, they also be focused on under the life science program. There's a lot of focus on the behavioral science. Dr. Meva Singh is one person I can just mention, is always focused on the behavioral science. There are quite a few experts again in IISc, other institution, even some of the professions of wildlife institute are focusing on behavioral aspects. I think there are.
I would suggest one thing for those who are really interested is reading up on, scientific literature. The minute you read scientific literature, you come across studies where people have looked at behavior. Look at who has done that study and then follow through and write to them and see if you can work with them and volunteer them. Those are the right people to ask because they're the ones who are doing this work. As for people who are asking about volunteering at wildlife centers, so there are, like Dr. Ramesh said, almost all the organizations that work in conservation in India accept volunteers. In fact, welcome volunteers. There's always shortage of passionate people working to work in the field. You just have to write to them, and mostly someone will reply and give you an avenue to work with them.
Right. Thank you so much. Hope Abhijna got an answer. There's one very interesting question about the barriers, about the, we spoke about the blurred line between the, forest and civilization. Maybe this question is asking whether this blurred line can be a permanent line. So this question is to Dr. Ramesh sir. Due to high dynamics of deforestation and loss of wildlife habitat, the increase of human-elephant conflict is linear and sometimes parabolic. Based on your experience of human-elephant conflict in India, how many kilometers of electric fences can effectively build and managed by community groups to reduce the conflict? Do you think the line shape, instead of the line, you have a circular fences that can be implemented to separate elephant habitat and community settlements? What crucial factors need to be considered in keeping the fence sustainable?
Oh, I think it's a very interesting and important question because this is a one solution that's been tried all over. I mean, the physical barrier. So habitat degradation and linear infrastructure. I mean, a lot of kind of facilitating factors which basically creates this conflict. But I mean, as far as my understanding goes, this particular, the interface is, except for some situation, it's so dynamic. So therefore, instead of trying to do a permanent kind of a structure, I would say strategic fencing. I call this term strategic fencing. When you say strategic fencing, that needs to be supported by local information. So you do it. I mean, sometimes what happens, you do a barrier, maybe the animal come and look at it and then go back, but then it will try to find a way. So we need to find a technology. See, this is one area for, I would say, that engineering professionals in the country. I've been discussing this with some of them. In fact, I see great potential to look at. In fact, I'm trying to reach out to IIT Madras. Conservation forestry technology. I think there's a new school needs to develop in the country, which focuses on conservation forestry technology. So even for creating this barrier, even for capture methods, we are still using a traditional method or experience-based method. So when I say strategic fencing, if you have some really sophisticated technique, which is that you erect it, if the situation changes, you are in a quick position to relocate it. So I think that is what we need to aim at. And that really requires involvement of engineering professionals, particularly mechanical engineering or your electrical electronic engineering you can do. So, I mean, that is my personal opinion. I feel that is, otherwise we invest so much money, it's broken, or you cannot do it, and an elephant or any other, you cannot also think of completely fencing. Yeah, some situation you can think of, you have money and resources, you fence the entire village, that's possible. But then whether that is going to affect some other side effects, we need to see locally.
Also, I think with species like the elephants who are so intelligent, they learn their way around all of these methods. That is the thing. They only last for so long until they find a way to overcome these, man-made interventions. So
I think we can only reduce the, conflict, but not completely mitigate it because it will always be the blurred line.
Exactly.
So that's why I call it human-wildlife conflict management.
Yeah. Okay. Right. So TNC Vidya ma'am is also here. So she is adding on to the volunteering questions. She's saying that I think volunteering is not as good as for the field in the long term as paid work. It privileges that those who don't need money. So I think we need to create a lot of job opportunities in this area so that a lot of people take up this opportunity and
Absolutely. I think I kind of explained the same thing in terms of volunteering can just be adding, but then it is not a. It will not be long lasting.
Yes, that's right. Thank you, TNC Vidya ma'am as well. There are last two more questions. I think we are also out of time, so let's quickly take this question. Sharayu wants to know, how is tourism impacting to contribute? So I mean, okay, let me ask it this way: is tourism really impacting the human-elephant conflict or human-wildlife conflict, or is it becoming a tool to contribute to the avoidance of? What's your opinion about wildlife tourism? Is it a disturbance?
Tourism, actually, it's again a very complex subject, depending on how it is done. I think as a philosophy, I think it's very important one, because tourism also allows us to build constituents of conservation support. It builds the economic resources to provide for conservation. But I think it can be a solution. In fact, when I was just mentioning about translocation and the capture and translocation, I mean, if I have my way, what I would do is I would probably try to create if in different ranges, have a small team by the professionals by the department, and then you have the local youth or whoever is participating. So create this local response unit. Tourists can participate. So maybe you can actually create like what you do in Africa, where people participate in translocation. Right. So I think this conflict management to some time can happen, but for that we need to get into really a perfection situation, because unfortunately in India, sometimes when you do a professional job, people don't really go into the details. The media represent very differently. So entire genuine efforts get discouraged. Right. So that is why many of the time people are very careful or afraid of taking some radical decision. So it can, but provided we need to, like as I said, educating the local people. I think a lot of education is required for the tourists.
Right. That's the real meaning of ecotourism, but then not really happening is
because of the same reason, because the tourist behavior is also needs to be accounted for, and then I think we need a really a strong skill set or develop the program for the tourists also.
I think again that's where that education part really comes in. It's really missing at every level, where tourists come in and we want their money, we want them to come and look at wildlife, we want them to do ooh-ah and post on Instagram, but we forget to educate them about what they're going to see, what to expect, how to behave, what the animals are going to feel. So whatever someone has asked, tourism does not affect human-wildlife conflict as such, but it does cause welfare issues for the animals. I mean, they are disturbed, and I mean, somebody needs to study whether these disturbed animals then go out and attack humans outside. I hope not. But that is a thing. We miss out on that education part completely. It's not about awareness, as Dr. Ramesh said. That's not what we're talking about. Education means we're actually telling people about the animals, what to expect from those animals, and not just say, oh, these are the species that we have in this park and these are the habitats. No, that's not what we're talking about.
Not to treat it as an entertainment object.
Right.
Exactly.
So awareness spread across tourism can help in conservation and avoid human-animal conflict, is what you're saying.
And it has to be treated as a privilege. You get the privilege of seeing an animal. So consider it as a privilege. Not everybody gets it. Not even the villagers living outside get to see those animals, right? Except in a conflict situation. So
and that, like Ramesh rightly said, I think in Africa there are programs where you can go and volunteer by paying into it, for relocation programs. I think that will also kind of give an exposure to people and also kind of contribute to the, the whole conservation of.
I think we are still far from that ethos of. So I would treat that very cautiously.
Yeah. It's a very
pay money in India to do this work may not be the people you want to attract. So
we need to really prepare both the sides. One side, the professional side, the other side is the people side. So, but then we cannot rule out. There's a scope.
Is also that do we have that kind of resource who can train and educate people to that extent? Is also something we need to be.
Lots of resources we have.
Yes.
Okay.
India is no more a poor country.
Right, sir.
I think it's a matter of
All
how
right, then
we
the
actually
last
analyze
question
it.
is from Aksha regarding the disease transmission. Yeah, that's right. Yes, sir. So the last question from Aksha is regarding the disease transmission from livestock. So leopards and elephant, depending on livestock. So what's your opinion about disease transmission?
I think I'll probably say briefly, I think Bindu is probably the right person to talk about it. But to me, I think that's one aspect we have not highlighted. I think that's a real aspect, the human-wildlife, that interface. I think the transmission probably need to find its strong space in whatever that we do. I think it's a huge gap area. I think Bindu probably will have better
Yeah,
explanation.
absolutely. Nowadays, when they say the world is becoming small, it's really becoming small for pathogens, especially. So earlier you had these sacrosanct forests where you had the wildlife species living in their areas, and then you had humans in their areas, and pathogens were distributed accordingly. That's not the case anymore. And species like elephants and leopards and all these other animals that use the interface a lot are the perfect vehicles to carry pathogens which may not necessarily affect them, but they're just carriers and they're moving these pathogens into the forest areas, and those animals again may not necessarily be affected by these pathogens, which could be human pathogens or livestock pathogens, but what happens is they keep them in circulation, they keep them as a reservoir is what we like to call. And so then next time when they come out to human habitations, they bring these pathogens back along with them, and we call it as a spillover event. They come out and there is an outbreak in the humans, and there is a disease and public health problems such as we've seen with COVID-19 and many other zoonotic diseases in the past. So that is definitely a very big threat, and not just in terms of human health, but also livestock health. So a lot of these communities around forests depend on livestock rearing, and that's their livelihood. So a lot of livestock around the forest get affected by many diseases, and their productivity is affected. So it's all building into livelihoods and human well-being as such, not just health, but well-being of the human populations in these areas. So definitely that's very important.
Right. Right. Thank you. Thank you so much for this very insightful session once again.
Hello.
Yes. Hi.
Good evening, Ramesh sir, Bindu sir, and Bindu mom, sorry, and uncle sir. Sir, my question is, I want to add one thing. Last year, one incident happened in Kerala. People fed one female pregnant elephant that ripened pineapple with pressure bomb. And if you look at the northeastern India, Western Ghat, and Eastern Ghat in central India, in greater landscape level, so there is some state like Chhattisgarh, Odisha, Assam, there is forest cover also increase as per our government forest survey of India record or government record. But why the conflict still going on? And last 1 to 3 years, so many elephants died in Odisha and this Jharkhand, West Bengal, and also in Assam, where the forest cover is very good. And one thing I have to add, the elephant mostly they corrupted during that time it's happened. So what is the who is the response for this? Whether the research institute or the forest department? What is your view?
Okay, the first question. I think it's the comparison is probably if you understand the topography, the landscape structure, you will have the answer. Both in the Western Ghats and the Northeast India, I think the terrain is one factor. So elephant will be forced to move around in certain direction. But when it comes to Central India, they can move anywhere they want. So forest cover, you increase, it doesn't matter. But then forest cover per se is in terms of quantity, you should be seeing in the context of the spatial distribution of the increase or decrease. So you might actually have increase in 1 or 2 divisions hugely, but then degradation can take place other one. But I think that's a different point altogether. But I think when it comes to the larger interaction Central India, because of the topography and the fragmentation, the high level of interface, I think that encounter probability of elephant and human is much higher in this region. Therefore, you would experience this as compared to Western Ghats or Northeast or in the Himalayas, even if you look at Rajaji, Corbett, all this landscape. So I think that should explain or clear your doubt on why this is happening in this part of the world, even though the number of individuals are not many. So you see the 3,000 individuals only, as compared to 15,000, 18,000 individuals in Western Ghats. You can also see in terms of the ratio. The second aspect is who's responsible. I think everybody's responsible. I would say that. I think this is very, I mean, of course, I mean, there's government has a mandate to different people, institutions or department will have their own mandate, but these are societal problem and there is a societal issue, okay? Societal issue means everybody needs to participate. It might sound very kind of philosophical when I say it's everybody needs to participate, but yes, if we're all very genuine about it, whatever role that we can play, I think we need to contribute. And even in the name of even trying to build some education material for people or even trying to work with them, be participate to know empowering NGO. There are many mechanisms. Probably, I probably don't have an answer to that, how it is to be done. But all I know is everybody's responsible.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much, sir. We are beyond our schedule as well, but thank you so much for the session and the questionnaire. So I'll hand it over back to Aksha for the thank you note.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It was. Thank you. It was nice. Thank you, Bindu.
Thank you very much, Uncle and Aksha.
Not putting me in trouble, so thank you so much.
Thank you, Uncle. Thank you so much for moderating the session. Once again, I would like to reinforce my thanks to both the speakers for making time and making this session very insightful and informative. I also thank all the participants for your patience and asking so many interesting questions. Also, thank you, Naveen, for managing this entire event behind the scenes. Um, thank you, everyone. Once again, you will find this. This was going live on Facebook, and you will find the recording of this video on YouTube as well. So with this, we'll close the session. Wish you all a very happy weekend. Stay safe. Good night.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye, Ramesh.
Bye-bye.